What's good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Gifted Hoops podcast. This is episode 50 of the pod. I feel pretty happy to have hit this overall milestone. I began this podcast last year, so I'm happy about that. And today, I'm joined here today by Grace. She's a phenomenal content creator, astute basketball knower, and she's one half of the What's in the Game pod with Will. They cover a bunch of Denver topics, but also just basketball and the NBA in general. Grace, introduce yourself to the people.
Hi, everyone. I'm Grace Jean. Like Gifted said, I'm a co-host of the What's in a Game podcast with Will Jones, and sometimes I think I know ball. I try to make the frequency of that as high as possible. But yeah, thanks for having me, Gifted. I'm really excited to talk about the Nuggets today.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled. Before we get officially into the conversation, for those of you who are listening on the audio platforms, the video version will be available on the YouTube side at Gifted Hoops, and also the podcast is available for audio listeners on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Again, Grace's links and all that will be in the description and all that below. Make sure to give her a ton of support. We love pushing creators in our community, and I love what she does. But let's officially get to it, right? So I'm gonna give you my perspective on this, right? So coming into 2024 season, Denver was looked at to be the best team in the NBA. And I was one of those believers in Denver. I was. People have to remember that 2023, like living in the run real time, what Denver was doing to their opponents, they were decimating a lot of them. And I think that Jokic officially was already the best player in the world before a lot of people. They came into that season 2 years ago saying, yeah, but he hasn't won. Can a center win? Like, from your perspective, going into that championship season, what were your thoughts about Denver?
So I don't know how many people that watch the pod know this about me, but I actually started following the Denver Nuggets during the 2023 title run. So my impression of the team was that I had never watched the Denver Nuggets before their round one series versus the Timberwolves in 2023. But as I think, connoisseur of media and media narratives, my impression, particularly going into the Phoenix Suns series, was that anybody but Denver was favored to win the title, win the West. And that is based on the fact that that year was actually the first time that I watched the playoffs from the play-in from round one. Most of the time I was watching from conference finals on. I was a certified casual NBA fan. And I was just like asking my fiance, who's the one that kind of got me into watching earlier rounds, like, okay, who's favored? Like, kind of give me the lay of the land as I'm, consuming all of this. And even he was like, well, it's Boston, it's Milwaukee, maybe the Warriors, that kind of thing. And when you go into the Phoenix Suns series, like, they were favored over the Nuggets. And that didn't quite make sense to me, because even though I didn't have a ton of experience with the team, watching them in round one versus the Timberwolves and watching the round one series between the Suns and the incredibly injured Clippers, it just didn't compute why, even after seeing all of that, the Suns would be favored over the Nuggets. I know they had Kevin Durant, I know they had Devin Booker, but I had just seen the Nuggets look absolutely incredible in this round one series. They had this two-time MVP at the time in Jokic, and obviously the Jokic Embiid MVP narrative was still out there, but everyone, it seemed like, should know like how good he is, because he, won the MVP that much. Seemed like Jamal was like rounding back into form. I was getting into that whole, coming back from the ACL narrative, and like, is he going to be what he was in the playoffs before? And, he had demonstrated that in round one. So going into that Phoenix Suns series in 2023, it was like, this team feels incredibly underrated. by, the media, the tastemakers, if you will, of NBA media. So that was my impression, was that they were underrated, but I didn't know by how much until they got to the Western Conference Finals, because I had also watched the Lakers run through the Grizzlies and absolutely dominate the Warriors in their round 2 series. And there were even, I started following the actual, have been following the team for years, Nuggets, media, to get a better idea of the team. And going into that Western Conference Finals with the Lakers, a lot of people were like, well, this could be a 4 or 5 game series. And I thought that was crazy, because I had just seen the Lakers look great. LeBron has been one of my favorite players forever, if not my favorite basketball player. And I was just like, they look dominant. Like, he and AD look dominant. This is not going to be a short series. Either team could win. And I kind of had this impression of some of them, these media members, is like, oh, they're just being homers. Mm-hmm. I watched that game 1, that first half of game 1, and I'm like, oh, this isn't close, actually. And the point differential of the entire series ended up being what it was, and that was one of the most interesting playoff series that I've ever watched, because I could kind of dig into X's and O's and all of that stuff. But it just felt like Denver had a counter for everything that LA was trying to do, really on both ends of the floor that year. And it was like, oh, okay, I understand now, like, there are levels to this. Right. And so, yeah, if that kind of answers your question of my impression of the team, was like, I feel like they're underrated, but I know they're really good. And then I got to see just how dominant they were, in the later stages of that playoff run, that title run.
Yeah, I want to back you up on that too, because I remember everything about the season. Often what I do is I take screenshots and logs of how people feel about the NBA teams before the season starts, mid-season, before the playoffs, and then after the season is over, because these things shift every now and then, right? And I remember the narrative on Denver coming into that title year is, we've never seen a center be like the best player on the team that, maybe isn't the best defensively, win a title, right? And they said that, like, in the modern era, at least, it shifted dramatically from that. And they didn't view Denver to be a team that could do that. But I came into the season like, okay, Jokic has been playing at an MVP caliber for like the past 2 seasons now. He's going to probably do it for a 3rd year. And now Jamal Murray is going to be back into the lineup at some point healthy. So for me, I said, okay, Denver could be a very serious team, because I know how good Jokic is. I understand the chemistry that Denver had. Now having all their guys back, they should be very good. And they were extremely good. But it seemed that despite how good Jokic was, there was always something to take away from that during the regular season. The MVP race probably got the most toxic it's been in like maybe the last, 6 years? I don't know. Like, it was a very loud thing the entire season. And then when they started to lose a bunch of games at the tail end of the season, they were like, oh, yeah, see, Denver's not real. Like, they're not winning games anymore. And it's like, guys, that's after they clinched the 1 seed and no other team could surpass them in the Western Conference. Like, they're just trying to get to the playoffs. At least that's how I felt. And then mid-season, obviously, KD gets traded to the Suns. And then for a lot of people, that team becomes like, oh, yeah, they have Chris Paul, they have Booker, KD. Like, this is going to be like a very, very good team. And I'm sitting there watching it like, who's the wing that's going to play very good defense on this team? Right. Like, okay, that's...
You could say that about them now too, but...
Yeah, like the same thing I said back then, I can say now. And then it's like, okay, DeAndre Ayton was a pretty good Jokic defender 2 years ago, back when they had met in the playoffs, sure. But I mean, for a full series with them actually having guard play, that's not Facu Campazzo and friends, I think that that's just a different team. So then coming into the playoffs, when we saw exactly how that panned out, I thought, okay, they're going to be a very good basketball team. And they were. We saw Jamal Murray rise, which is so funny, like how high his level gets in the playoffs over and over, right? Like it makes it hard to rank him as a player. Yeah, like just like I will never forget in the bubble, the layup, the reverse scoop layup in traffic. Like he's just a very, very, talented player. So anyway, they get into the playoffs and then they play the Suns. And I remember watching the series, like, do people think the Suns are a bad matchup for Denver? Is that what we're saying? Because like they had a perimeter play, cool, but their idea was get Jokic in the pick and roll, find a mismatch, mid range. It's just free. And I'm like, you guys do realize you're losing the math battle. How are they going to guard the
double drag? How does anyone ever guard double drag?
How can you guard the double drag? And I'm sitting there watching it, right? Game 1 to me was the biggest example of everything because I kept saying Phoenix is going to be outmatched in the series because they're going to lose the math battle because Denver's going to out-rebound them. They're going to shoot more threes. They're going to have more points in the paint. And for the entire season, Phoenix's shot profile with and without KD was a mid-range oriented team. They were really reliant on the in-between shot more than, threes or layups. And I thought in a full series against Denver with Jamal Murray, who they didn't really have a good guard for, and Jokic, I thought that would give them a hard time, and you guys dominated them. Then, as we get to your point, the conference finals, which like, it's just funny because the entire year we saw the Lakers be inconsistent for the most part. They made the trades and they were like the best defense towards the tail end of the season, but the same flaws that the team had the entire year showed, and we saw Jokic rise to a different level in that series. So overall, I say all this to say Denver was a legitimate, serious team. Then they go to the finals. A lot of people don't speak about the finals as much because the Heat were kind of decimated through the Eastern Conference run and they got beat pretty convincingly. And that led to Denver winning the title. So now, with all that context being set up, now you go into last season as big title favorites. People have all of this utmost respect for Denver, all this and all that. Coming into 2025 off of a championship where the core all stepped up in their own ways, where we saw Mike Malone have great counters for every coach that he played. How did you feel about them heading into last season?
I felt very, very good about them. The two kind of favorite teams, and everyone thought that they would be the finals matchup, were the Nuggets and the Celtics, who had also improved dramatically last summer with the moves that Executive of the Year Brad Stevens made, right? So that was kind of the measuring stick that from the beginning of the season was kind of like, this is the next closest team. And yeah, I felt like, okay, like the Nuggets could still win a title. We had lost Bruce in free agency. We lost Jeff Green in free agency. But I thought, okay, this is going to be an opportunity for Christian Braun to step up. Peyton Watson was still a big fat question mark because he had barely played NBA minutes in his first season. And, he played a couple, the like perfunctory, like 2 games in summer league. That's like, okay, show us what you got. And it was like, okay, it's like a little wild. He's going to be a rotation guy. Let's see. Let's see what he can give us on a consistent basis. And, that was a nice, also like a surprise. Like, this is what's happening at the beginning of the season. I'm like, oh, we got some guys, right? And, we go back to that first night on opening night, ring night for the Nuggets. They're playing the Lakers, right? And the Nuggets never look better than when they're playing the Los Angeles Lakers.
That was a crazy that was a crazy time. Yeah.
It's every Lakers game, but it was great that it was ring night, right? Because everyone was like, well, say I don't do any sports betting myself, but I like to watch some of their analysis podcasts just to get like a different perspective on the game. And a lot of them were thinking like, do you bet Lakers against the spread maybe, or like maybe Lakers to win, because like sometimes teams on their ring night ceremony are just like a little bit less focused, all this stuff. The fact that it was the Los Angeles Lakers on that opening night meant everybody on that team was locked in, because they just never look. Every single player on that team has big moments, big stretches against the Lakers. Whether it's, Jokic because of that AD matchup, or AG always has, big games because he's really important defensively against LeBron, even though you can't really stop him at all. It's just like, let's tire him out and hope he misses some layups at the end of the game. That's basically how every one of those games has gone. Whether it's Jamal just cooking them because their point of attack is, sad, or MPJ is a sniper. I think LeBron called him a laser on his podcast, and MPJ has amazing games against them, right? So they were incredibly focused, and they had this stretch at the beginning of the season, starting from that first game, where everyone was like, oh, they're just like still locked in. They're still in championship mode. Started slumping, after Jamal goes out with his first injury last season. And that was when I think I started to see the championship hangover is starting to set in, and it's compounded by the fact that Jamal is out, which is putting more on the rest of the team. We had Reggie Jackson stepped up as a backup ball handler, particularly in that spot starting role when Jamal was out. But you also started to see in that first half of the year, teams were guarding Denver differently. And I think they played the Timberwolves pretty early in the season. I think it was like their 7th game or something. But I didn't make too much of that game. Jamal actually was present for that game. But I didn't make too much of it because I was just like, whatever, it's on the road, they don't care. It wasn't until they were playing the Houston Rockets and it was with Jamal out that I started to see teams giving up particularly a bunch of above the break threes to the Nuggets in order to sell out and try to keep Jokic out of the paint, right? And it was particularly noticeable in the stretch when Jamal was out, because one of the biggest, or I guess highest volume counters that they have to that sort of thing is just running that Jokic Murray pick and roll. And, he couldn't for them. So it was just really difficult to get the offense going. Like you started to see, like I was complaining all season about the offense, and it was in different phases, particularly transition. Like they're not playing with enough pace. Yeah. Like they're playing, they're a team that plays slow. That is for sure. But I thought that it was, to a degree that was not normal. And was it because they're fatigued? Like whatever it is. At one point they were, I think, 30th in transition offense. On the season. It was nasty. And it was just like, you started to see all these little things that I'm like, all right, well, this would have made the regular season a lot better. But, I'm in my head rationalizing, like, if they're just a good half court offense, which they were for the entire year, then that's conducive to playoff basketball and, all of this stuff. But, you started to see all of the tiny ways that they had gotten worse on the margins between 2023 and last year. So yeah, that's kind of like my, how I felt at the beginning and how it started to erode a little bit. But ultimately, I felt like they could still win the title, win every possible matchup that they had in the playoffs if, everybody did their jobs. Right. Well, from my perspective, I'll say this. I'm a Warriors fan. I just want that to be clear for people who might not know that. I'm a Warriors fan. I kind of knew we were cooked once we signed Chris Paul and traded away Jordan Poole. So I just said, I'm going to just enjoy basketball. Coming into the season for me, Grace, Denver and Boston were the two favorite matchups to make it out of the West and the Eastern Conference. What I did say starting, though, is
the team that really has a chance to beat Denver for me was always Minnesota. And the main reason behind that was the offense for them is questionable, but the athleticism in terms of them being able to get out in transition, having a good POA for guards, having Anthony Edwards, and more importantly, having the front court size to contend with Denver is why I felt like they had a chance. A lot of people brought up how they played in like the first round versus Denver last year. And they said, oh, well, maybe if they had Jalen McDaniels, it would be like a different series. I said, maybe, but I kind of felt like Anthony Edwards needed to go through another year of a really big offensive leap. And I feel like this year, that's really what he did. He was taxed with more offensive responsibilities, especially after Cat went out. And the growth from Rudy Gobert from year 1 to year 2. I thought this year he was going to be a leader for Defensive Player of the Year. He wound up winning that. And I said that Denver is a very good team. But what I'm questioning is, okay, when teams make the adjustment of adding in more above the break threes, is Denver going to utilize Aaron Gordon more as a ball handler? Because I think he has been terrific. I think he was a big unsung hero of why Denver won in the first place, because he was that dynamic four-man who could do so many things athletically. The amount of cross-matching y'all did versus the Heat and the Lakers were ridiculous, and he played a big role in that. And I felt like for Minnesota, they were the only team in the West who could actually like throw size at those types of matchups and kind of, lessen it from happening as much as other teams who simply did not have the personnel.
Take away all of those little easy things that the Nuggets tend to win on the margins when they have that size mismatch. Yeah, for sure. I do think that there are two things, well, kind of 2.5 things that I think were the biggest difference makers for Minnesota this year compared to last, particularly versus Denver. The first, and I think is the most important, is actually just how much better Cat was on both ends of the floor in their matchup versus Denver. I actually think that Cat is if I could pick one player that the biggest X factor that killed us, it was Cat. Constantly attacking mismatches, in particular, they were going after Jamal a lot in that series this year. Denver wasn't sending a ton of doubles. I was like, what are we doing here? And defensively, like you said, that size he provides, and he did a much better job of largely staying out of foul trouble. That was a big thing that
was a big thing for the series, yeah.
Huge, especially because you had both Nas and Jaden out. And so the other two things or things I was going to say that made the difference is because Nas and Jaden were healthy, you didn't have a who played in that series? I think Taurean Prince started a game in 2023.
I think he did.
Jordan McLaughlin was getting real minutes in certain games. When I went back and watched that, I was like, oh gosh, what's going? And God, I can't remember. It was another guard. They were just much smaller and players that really probably shouldn't be important to your playoff rotation that they had to play because of those guys being injured. And that also contributed to the, wider margin between the two teams in 2023. I don't know how you feel about that, as I know you're a Warriors fan, but I also know from the timeline that you are, pretty into the Timberwolves as well. How do you feel about that assessment of the biggest difference makers for the Wolves this year?
I think that's the right one. I kept saying that Cat is such a variance player from the perspective that on one night he can be arguably the best player on the floor with how he plays, or he can be in foul trouble, really settle, take bad shots, and be a floor negative. And I felt like for this team to really take that step, Karl-Anthony Towns defensively was going to have to be there, because I kept saying Aaron Gordon is the guy that kills these teams because of the attention that's on Jamal, because of the attention that, is on obviously Big Yoke. When he's on the floor, if you don't have a guy that can be there for the lobs to pay attention there, you're kind of cooked. And for Cat to be so good to where he could guard Jokic individually at times and not to have to instantly send a quick double, it helped Gobert take Aaron Gordon out of the game in certain games. Obviously, every game, it changes, but having that front court with Cat being reliable in that aspect was super big for them. I think that was huge. I think the Jaden McDaniels piece is a big part of it as well, because they had no cover for Jamal last year. They still, played hard, but
I thought Nikhil did a pretty good job, actually.
Well, yeah,
I think Nikhil actually did a better job of anybody that I saw, because I went back when I was doing the kind of playoff previews, like matchup previews for each series.
Yeah.
And Jamal was our focal point that they're focusing on. And I actually think Nikhil is the best singular defender on Jamal, because he can kind of guard all of the things in isolation and obviously get through all the screens both on and off the ball. And I think there was something that I was trying to point out, okay, this defender's really good at this, even on Jamal. But Jamal's so versatile, he can do lots of different things. This is how they have to attack them. Nikhil had the fewest things that were oh, this is a weak point we can try to exploit, and it took more energy, I think, than any defender that I looked at against Jamal.
Yeah, I was highlighting Jay McDaniels really from the sense that last year your primary had to be Nikhil, and I felt like the minutes and the energy that took from him was too much. I felt like adding back in Jaden, who could switch on to bigger defenders a bit more than him, kind of helped in those spots. Also, having the flexibility to now have Ant plugged in as your POA as well was huge, but their collective combination of perimeter and front court defense is what was able to, unlock them to win those other categories to win. I feel like the other teams that have played them in the past simply could not win the math battle in those overall respects. So yeah, that was fun to watch.
I think that's a really good point. I will say on the Ant point, the fact that Ant was so good, particularly on the ball, on Jamal, I think made a massive difference in that series, in large part because it meant that they could keep Jaden, who is excellent both on and off the ball, on MPJ. There were stretches when they had Jaden on Jamal, and I think that Jaden did a great job on Jamal, but
he was much better off ball.
Things that you could see much better off ball. But there were things that could still be exploited there. And Ant sometimes gets lost off the ball. When he's on the ball, he's engaged because he knows what his assignment is right in front of him. But when you have say Ant on MPJ, he can break free a lot easier. So I think the fact that Ant was so good on the ball on Jamal made it, just had this multiplicative effect on their perimeter defense. Combining that on and off ball kind of dominance, really, defensively.
Yeah, and I do want to bring this player up because this actually goes back into the title run and really why a lot of people had Denver winning. I think we have to address Michael Porter Jr. because his career arc is very interesting, where he was a very uber talented high school player, easily one of the best, and then his injuries kind of made him fall where he fell in the draft. And I always viewed him as a very good player. I still feel on volume, he had one of the most impressive 3-point shooting seasons ever. He was on fire that one year. He gets hurt and now he comes back. My thing with him coming into this year that I really wanted to see more of was him being able to get to his own shot a bit more in terms of self-creation. I feel like he's a phenomenal complementary piece that really opens up so much in Denver's offense. But I think the growth of him moving forward from last year, I thought would be the contributing piece to give them a bit more juice offensively sometimes when shots aren't falling. And I feel like him not being able to fully realize that is a part of why the series went the way that it did. I heard you say that Jaden did a good job on him. I agree with that, but I also feel like there are moments where he had Mike Conley guarding him and just he couldn't create an advantage consistently versus that coverage too.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's funny because when I was, doing all the prep for previewing these series, I was obviously watching the 2023 series to try to understand these different matchups. And I felt like he did a really good job both on and off the ball of just constantly creating those mismatches and, punishing him in the way that he does, which is to kind of do a, kind of mid-range turnaround fadeaway, but he was, cashing them.
I'm taller than you.
He looked a lot. He looked a lot less comfortable in that sense this year. That was something that really stood out to me comparing the two series. I think it was the case in round 1 versus the Lakers as well. When you go through the 2023 playoff series, there are certain exploits that the Nuggets would just go after aggressively and in volume, right? Whether it was whoever is on D-low, if you have them in front of you in semi-transition and you have the ball, like, just go, right? You're either going to bend the defense or you're going to get, not just creating the cross matches, but just aggressively going after and like hunting those mismatches, whether it's like putting them in actions or going at them one-on-one, whatever it was. I don't think they even attempted anywhere near the volume of that as they did in 2023 this year, both in the round 1 series versus LA and in the Timberwolves. And not that there's a ton of options on the Timberwolves, especially now, like I said, you don't have Taurean Prince starting playoff games, right? You have Jaden McDaniels, of Naz Reid. And, there were some stretches where like Naz was having some issues when he was put in certain actions and that kind of thing, for sure. But in particular, the one that I think of is the Mike Conley, mismatch. Because in 2023, Jamal was going at him relentlessly. You had Bruce Brown going at him relentlessly. AG, MPJ, just constantly. Because
everybody was going at him.
And I think that was really important because if you could get him off the floor, you could maybe collapse the Timberwolves offense.
Yes.
Right. And I just don't think that it was even, it's not that they did and it didn't work. It's that I don't think that, Jamal obviously much more limited this year because of the calf. But, there are lots of different ways. Like I said, it's not just about going after someone in 101. It's putting them in lots of actions and trying to create an advantage that way. And I don't know how much of it to separate out from like game plan versus execution of, trying to do that. But I do think that the fact that MPJ couldn't shake Jaden off the ball, it made it harder to consistently even like create, that mismatch. And even when he did, part of it's because like Mike Conley is still like battling as best he can at this stage in his career, and I just don't think that he was aggressive enough to fully take advantage of the limited opportunities that he did have. But no, I agree with you about like how big of an X factor he is, obviously, right? Like I think that he won us that series versus LA this year because he
torching that off-ball defense
over us. Yeah, exactly right. But took advantage of it. Poor Rui, but hopefully he figures it out, or not. But yeah, just being able to punish mistakes, right? Even that, because even the best defensive team is going to have lapses sometimes, and I feel like during the regular season. And last year and in that first round playoff series, MPJ was more consistently just punishing mistakes, even though they weren't making them as often, the Timberwolves, and they have a little bit more margin for error because of all the size and length that they have. I do think that there, is just more that the Nuggets need from him, particularly when you're in a situation where your second option and Jamal is substantially more limited than he was during the title run.
Absolutely. And like, that's why I said coming into the playoffs, like the only team that I really thought could beat Denver based off how they were. And this is before like I saw Jamal Murray kind of struggling with like the injury and like how he performed against, I would say LA, is that no other team really had that defensive personnel who could also get downhill consistently in the West to me. OKC was an interesting team, but I kind of felt like Chet's inabilities at times offensively would kind of hurt them. I feel like the rebounding thing was the issue. Like there are multiple areas where I feel like Denver was size-wise, which is going to be a harder matchup for them. And I think versus the Wolves, I hope MPJ is able to grow a bit more in those aspects because he was such a killer versus LA. Because again, as you said, right, like the off-ball defense where they just could not keep a man on him. The amount of times Rui Hachimura got caught ball watching or just outright forgetting he was there was insane. And like, I'm pretty sure in that series, he averaged like 25 or 24 points per game, and it's off great shot quality, right? Like those were the differences. I felt like the way Minnesota guarded Denver was a very aggressive coverage, which you noted in the pod, took the gas out of them in the games, which is why a lot of this series is just blowouts because it's either they're dominating or you're dominating. And it all came to a head, I would say, in game 7, really, where just the team kind of ran out of gas, especially like being up 20 points in the building, but no one could really buy a shot is really what sealed out the series. But that's how close both of those teams were. And that takes me to the other player who, KCP, which during the championship run, I thought KCP was so integral because he had so many moments, especially versus the Lakers in the conference finals. I have it etched in my brain, the amount of difficult shots that he would make in the non-Jokic minutes, where it's like, wow, none of these teams are beating them in the non-Jokic minutes, which normally is a dramatic problem. And his shot making and his overall savviness was big, big. This playoffs, not so much. And I feel like that really hurt them because he was the only other real shooter on this team, not named, I would say, MPJ. I think Jamal's great, but I think he's asked to do so much. But in terms of like a standstill shooter, KCP's role was so big in that sense, and not having that be as consistent this year kind of hurt you too, I feel like.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And I think that actually, Justin Holiday was like our best shooter in that series, at least for half of it. He kind of ran out of, he was shooting like 50% from 3 or something.
He played big minutes too. Yeah.
On the series, but all of those makes were in the first 4.5 games. And he did play some big minutes because we had such a shrunken rotation. I'm sure we'll get to that when we talk about the off season, but I think that was a big part of it as well. You're talking about how much energy really defending both of these teams actually takes for the Timberwolves because of their athleticism, for Denver because of just the combination of everything that they've got going offensively with Jokic and how everybody operates around Jokic, right? That having a shortened rotation puts you at, like, it inherently will put you at a disadvantage because the other players are more fresh. And we saw that both in game 7 when we talked about Cat doing a better job of staying out of foul trouble, but he did either foul out or he was like at 5 fouls towards the end of those games, and Nas had to come in for him. And for all his limitations, like Nas was coming in on fresh legs. He had big offensive rebound putbacks in both of those games. And it was a really interesting, I sort of think of the ends of game 1 and game 7 as interesting bookends to that series because they were great illustrators of the differences in the two teams, right? Everybody's talking about like, well, how important is depth when you've got your core guys, and well, when one of your core guys, in particular Jamal, is so limited, and then we can talk about how tired were the rest of particularly the starters going into the playoffs and all this stuff, championship hangover, playing all the way through game 82. It turns out it matters a lot when the other team has all of these athletes and they're young and they're hungry and they know they're good, right? That was something that really stood out about the Timberwolves the entire season, is that they know they can win. Like they feel like, I think rightly, they feel like they on any given night can beat any team. And that really like showed up, particularly the ends of those games, right? And it's, everyone talks about like, oh, the Nuggets are so good in the clutch, all this stuff. It's funny because going through the title run, all of the games that they lost were close games. They weren't necessarily winning everything in the clutch. And I think that being too reliant on that is, a dangerous game. And we saw that play out this year. But it was the Timberwolves and their energy and their hunger, and they were the ones that were able to execute, particularly defensively in those moments, that won them those, critical games, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Not yet. I think that is 100%. This team was such an interesting team because, again, I think they showed you flashes this year versus LA where the Lakers couldn't get over the hump, but it's like, damn, every time they're getting off to slow starts. And a lot of it came because of transition sometimes, because of rebounding sometimes. And then in the second halves of games, they would just get the turnovers, which is, trust me, as a Warriors fan, I understand turnover issues. I really, really do. I promise you I do. And I feel like that was getting the ball to teams in spots because of that. And I think having to rely on making those comebacks, it takes a lot of energy out of you to consistently rely on that. And I think the biggest difference is LA didn't have enough athleticism as a team. And I think their backcourt with D'Lo and also Austin Reeves just had so many variance games overall to where game to game to game, it just wasn't as consistent. And even though the games were super duper close, those are the martyrs that we're talking about. And I think the Wolves as a full complete team were just able to capitalize on more of those because you had Nikhil, who was a great guy off your bench, even though he couldn't buy shots either. And then you had Naz Reid,
he actually had a pretty rough series, Nikhil, I think.
Yeah.
I don't think he was nearly as impactful defensively either this year.
Yeah, he kind of had like a step back. I felt like his defense was a lot more felt in the first round for them, but then his shot making kind of died. And then in that series, it was really, okay, Jaden McDaniels and then Anthony Edwards, in those spots. But Jaden's off-ball versatility was a big part of that. But that takes me to this. So after the playoffs concludes for Denver, a lot of people then try to have this, I would say, revisionist history because it's crazy how fast the bar swings, right? They go from a team that has a fraudulent MVP that is fake. He's not a winner. He can't win anything. They're like not a real team. They win. Now they're a dynasty. They're the favorites. They got to do this, that. Then they lose to a team that I always said on paper was one of the like biggest threats to Denver that could beat them outside of the Boston, team. That happens. And then now it's like they were never real to begin with. I don't agree with that. I just felt like they were always a team that could be had in those spots. And I feel like a lot of that is because losing Bruce Brown as another ball handler, just, that with his defense hurts. And now to lose KCP, even though he underperformed in the playoffs, I still feel his overall value in terms of defense and the shooting, losing both of those in 2 seasons kind of changes the dynamic of what Denver can be, which really brings us to their inner player development now, I would think.
Yeah, I agree. And if you want to hop over to the offseason discussion, I've made my thoughts on letting KCP walk be very well known. I think it was a bad idea. They're making certain calculations, it seems, when it comes to both, Christian Brown probably taking a step up into the starting role. But I think that just losing KCP as an option defensively at the point of attack, given how impactful he is as a defensive player, screen navigator, like the Nuggets were excellent in defending pick and roll this season, in large part because like there are so many little things that KCP does that don't show up in a box score. And it's not just, the steals or the blocks, it's the ball denial. The amount of impact that you can have when you can keep the ball out of the best scorer's hands for large stretches of a game is massive. And, Christian has certain strengths that KCP doesn't have, but I do think that losing such a core defensive piece, you talked about losing Bruce Brown last year. It's interesting that the Nuggets actually took a massive jump defensively this season compared to last. Ended up a top 10 defense, depending on the list that you look at. They were like really close actually to being a top 5 defense. KCP was a huge part of that.
100%.
And I'm really curious to see if that holds next year with this new configuration of the team. And for all their offensive struggles that we talked about, they were still a top 5 offense. And so people were like, throughout the season, I'm complaining about all of these issues with the offense, and they did manifest themselves in the playoffs for sure. But I would always get people in my mentions saying like, they're still top 10, they're still top 5, like what's the big complaint? So that tells you, despite being 30th in transition offense, which should like really tank any team's like regular season offensive ranking, because this team has Jokic, because this team has Jamal, they end up as a top 5 offense. That tells you how high the floor actually is for this team, particularly offensively. But I think the fact of KCP's NAG had a great defensive season as well, but especially KCP, because he and Jokic are put in so many actions together as teams are constantly trying to attack Jokic, right? And they figured they had such a great chemistry in all of these different defensive coverages. The Nuggets were playing a lot more drop this season, which it's interesting that they got better defensively when I think it's actually their worst coverage. Blitzing, hedging, Jokic playing more at the level, which I think is like his best thing. Switch to blitz coverages, and the communication and the chemistry between Jokic and KCP and the timing and all of those coverages and guarding things 2-on-2. I think it was really big. And I'm really curious to see if Christian is going to be able to bring that same level of just consistent engagement and communication that's going to be necessary, because I think that chemistry and communication is more important in NBA defense now, like more than ever. And I think that's another like layer of what they're losing when they lost KCP. But what happens then is Christian moves up obviously in the rotation, but you also get more time for Peyton Watson. He becomes even more important guarding some of those primary options on the perimeter. It's interesting that, there are certain matchups that I think they're really going to miss KCP for. The Steph Currys of the world, absolutely. I think that's the best one. Maybe the Damian Lillards of the world as well. But you look at the primary perimeter options on the best teams out there, and they are a little bigger. They're more of these like guard wing combos. Sometimes like a wing forward in the case of a Jason Tatum, who I actually think KCP did a great job on, despite the ridiculous size mismatch and all of that too, right? Like KCP did so much. But like I can see some of what the thinking is there in terms of the proportion of specific matchups that you would need a KCP for, versus like Christian may also do really well in this because he's got more size, he's got a bit more strength. He's excellent he's an excellent like shot blocker for a guard, if you want to consider him that. I'm worried about the screen navigation for sure. I think KCP was the best screen navigator on the team by a wide margin. And so that's maybe the team is able to do a bit more switching because Christian has more of that size and they're not worried about generating too many mismatches. But no, I agree. Like I'm worried because I don't want to lose versatility. But again, Peyton Watson, he is actually a pretty a monster guarding players one-on-one. I would like to know, like, I'm curious to see how he's going to do in the team context, right? Because he has so much potential as a help defender.
Right.
And obviously he played in the rotation last year, but he's going to be playing probably bigger minutes and more consistently, and they're going to need him to develop into a consistent player at least offensively, and some skills so that he can stay in the playoff rotation, because we lost 3 members of our really 7-man playoff rotation this summer. And so he's going to have to play. Like that's just the reality of it. And I do think that the fact that he has to play does create some optimism for what the defensive ceiling of the team is in the playoffs. But I didn't think that the defense was at all the main issue last season either. So it's more concerning that I don't know that they solved the thing that I thought was the most concerning, which was the offense. And now the defense has an opportunity to take a step back. But it could also be better. It just depends on these young players, and they're big question marks right now.
Yeah, I gotta say, you buy that, by the way. That was great analysis. For me, that's what my question with the KCP loss was, because for me, like, it's not just defensive versatility. It's just as a player on both ends, because he was a sniper this year as well from 3. Like he's one of the best volume 3-point shooters in the league. And then on top of that, defensively, he provided so much, grace for the entire team, I felt like. And I feel like with him gone, Christian Braun played pretty good defense on, I would say, Anthony Edwards for the whole series, I would say. But in terms of being able to navigate the screens as good as KCP, I kind of think he's far from that. And the real issue for me is I do feel like with Denver, their problem was having another ball handler who could take pressure off and make the game easier in the half court and even full court. And I think Christian Braun isn't quite that either. I think offensively, I have a lot of questions for him because he's not a willing shooter. He's not a respected shooter. And sure, even if you want to say that if you plug him in defensively, he can approximate some of the value for KCP, offensively it becomes a much harder fit for Denver. And I would kind of say the same thing is true about Peyton Watson as well. Like, he can be a very good overall play finisher, I think, but his shot is also kind of questionable. And I feel like in multiple lineups with those players, that's going to be what it comes down to sometimes, which is why Malone pulled them, I think, last year. And I think the one player that might be able to bridge the gap is probably Julian. I haven't seen too much of him in terms of how he'll be able to translate with this roster. But I think when you have Jokic, Aaron Gordon, and also MPJ, you want to have players that can be somewhat balanced on both ends. If you're like an offensive liability with that, that becomes a lot harder to manage.
No, I agree. And you talked about the need for another ball handler that can take some pressure off of Jamal, but put pressure on the opposing team's defense, both in the half court and in transition in the open court. I completely agree with that. And something that really strikes me about Christian Braun is he is so athletic. And when he has those moments, when he knows it, he can really do some damage. In particular, like we talk about it, like Christian played last year, and he's not just moving up in the rotation. He's probably going to be playing more in a position where he's going to have a size advantage on whoever's against him on the opposing team, right? That's generally how it's going to go, especially because you look at last year, both in the regular season and the playoffs. The reason KCP gets open so often is because other teams will often put one of their weaker defenders on him, right? Because he has a more limited offensive role for the most part. And that was why he was able to cook D'Lo so thoroughly whenever they played the Lakers, right? With Christian, there are some, you talked about him being not a respected shooter, which I really just don't expect that to be the case for, he's going to have to shoot like 40% from 3 on volume for several years.
Maybe 5 or 6 attempts. Yeah, I agree.
Sure. But in terms of being a willing shooter, that's the point that I need him to get to next season. Like from the beginning, ideally, but at least by midway through the season, because he has these games, and I always think back to it. The Nuggets played the Pelicans. It was in New Orleans last season. and it was in a loss. They went down huge, spent a bunch of energy trying to come back. I think it was while Jamal was out also. Couldn't quite get over the hump at the end, but Christian had a massive game. I think it was his career high of something like 25 points or whatever. And he was scoring in every which way possible. Oh, guys go under a screen. I'm going to take this open three. I'm going to use the fact that they're going under a screen and Jokic is going to basically create a driving lane for me on that. Or when they miscommunicate and we try to force a switch, he was attacking in transition. I saw him make, I believe it was an and one reverse layup through Jonas Valanciunas and Zion Williamson in transition. It was just like, whoa, where did this aggressive guy come from? And then that was a flash that happened at the beginning of the season. And you see that he has this ability, but he's not always confident about that. So I actually have, I made notes for this, and my 2 words for Christian next season is that he needs to gain his confidence and he needs to improve his finishing, right? His rookie year, he was, 68% at the rim, something. This last season, he was 59%. I have no idea what happened with that.
Oh, he dropped. Oh, wow.
Massive drop off. And a lot of the shots, it's just hurried, just hurrying to try to put something up, whatever it is. But when you think about his skills or his potential skills compared to a KCP, if he's going to have a slightly different offensive role, I do think that this offense is going to look different because it will have to. He has to be able to take advantage of his size, of his athleticism. He's incredibly bouncy. Everyone knows about game 80 versus the Wolves, and he had that ridiculous left-handed dunk over Rudy.
Tough.
And I'm like, where did this kid come from? Because you're like, oh, this kid, he struggles with his confidence sometimes. When he thinks he only has half an advantage, he'll sometimes hesitate. And then he'll have these other moments where he's like, nope, I'm just going to go for it. And mistakes will be made, right? Yeah. Because he is, going into his 3rd year in the NBA now. And he's probably going to be starting on a team that has title aspirations. And so I understand, he had the reason that the team, the front office, likes him is because he knows his role. He's, unselfish, all that stuff, not hijacking possessions, a la, like a Dylan Brooks. He's not going to call his own number. But there are other times where, he needs to stay aggressive. This is something that Jokic says about a lot of different Nuggets. Whenever he has these, post-game interviews where someone else has a really good game, they ask him, he's like, I just tell him he needs to stay aggressive. And I think that is especially the case for Christian. And when it comes to, I actually think that Peyton has a better chance of becoming that, especially in the full court ball handler that can put a lot of pressure on the defense. He's also he's incredibly athletic. Maybe I need to think about it, but he might be the most athletic player on the team behind AG now. He's a monster actually in the open court when he doesn't, always go for a fancy dunk, and he can just make the layup or make the clean dunk. He also needs to work on his finishing, but he's, he played point guard in high school, had a more limited role in college, obviously, but he's got really interesting court vision. He's shown really great flashes, both in the open court and in the half court when it comes to the playmaking, for sure. And I think that, you mentioned Julian as well, the front office is hoping that at least one of these guys can at least develop into, can pop into particularly that secondary ball handler role, just someone else that can put some pressure on the defense, especially when it comes to attacking on a second side, for example. I think Julian is the furthest along in that, but he doesn't have quite the same, defensive floor, especially as the other two, and certainly not the defensive ceiling as the other two. And so if it could be one of the other guys, I think that, develops into that, then we have some more options to go to.
Yeah. And that actually takes me to another offseason move you guys made, because I kept saying a big part for Denver that felt so noticeable was the other ball handler, because if Jamal is under constant pressure, the only other guy would then be KCP at times. And to me, it's like you needed more than that. You guys signed Russell Westbrook, a very polarizing player. I want to be clear. Russell Westbrook actually brought me to the game of basketball, which is a wild thing that happened, but it happened that way. I don't know how to feel per se, because I do think there's value in what he can provide for a regular season. I think he can give these players confidence, and I do think for a regular season setting, I do think having him as your backup with athletes off the bench can be very good. But in terms of like potency for a playoff series, how is that going to work if he's plugged in with Jokic and Jamal? Does Jamal then default to more of a shooting guard role? Because Russ is better kind of on the ball, but at the same time, it's like that's not really Denver's, scheme. They don't need to do that. There could be some cool Jokic and Russ inverted pick and rolls that you can maybe do, but how do you feel about his role on the team? And do you think he can be a useful player in terms of the postseason?
Yeah, so I completely agree with you. I think that he can be incredibly not just useful in that role, but actually an upgrade in that role for the regular season. He brings so much energy. Something that I clocked during this past regular season was everyone was talking about the Clippers slumping so hard after the All-Star break. Like they were at some point trying to make sure that they got out of that little play-in playoff margins rat race, and then they were just trying to hold on to a top four spot. But Russ was injured during that stretch, and you could see just the difference. He's someone that when he comes onto the court, you have certain players like Russ, TJ McConnell, Jose Alvarado, that the whole tenor of the game can change when they come in just because of the energy that they bring, even if nothing else, right? And obviously all those players are also skilled, and they also happen to be point guards, right?
Right.
I agree that, regular season, the energy, the rim pressure, which is not really something that we had really from many of our guards. Like that's not really Reggie Jackson's game at volume, but it's basically all Russ does, right? He's driving in there and either trying to make a shot, or something that I really appreciate is how often he's, whether it's hunting assists or whatever, trying to find guys, because I do think that we need to make a more concerted effort in those non-Jokic minutes of trying to play some semblance of coherent basketball that gets as many players involved as possible. But when it comes to the postseason, I agree it's a big question mark. And we've talked about some of the limitations that especially these young players have on one or the other end of the floor, and that's going to create a bit of a puzzle. Let's assume that no one makes a leap from where they've been between Peyton, Christian, and Julian. That's going to create a bit of a puzzle when it comes to creating rotations for the playoffs. And what I don't want to add is another layer to that puzzle, because you decide we can't play Jamal and Russ together. So there's other combinations that need to be, sort of catered to just because of their limitations. I think that the key to Russ being a substantial impact on next year's playoffs compared to this last year is figuring out a way that he and Jamal can play together, whether Jokic is on the floor or off. We're probably going to get a heavy dose of trying to make that work, because Michael Malone really likes staggering Jamal Murray with the bench, and that will mean that he plays at least some of his minutes with Russ in particularly the non-Jokic minutes. I'm not even saying that they need to play together well with Jokic, although Jokic kind of makes every lineup work.
Everything go,
He really does. It just means that that's one more shooter that Russ could play with. And when you're trying to construct these lineups around him, even for a playoff setting, Russ on the ball means you want to have as much space around him as possible. And we do have a much more limited core of good shooters on this team with KCP leaving, right? We did add Dario Saric, of course. and Julian is probably going to play a more prominent role in the rotation, at least in the regular season. I think we're gonna need him to stay healthy and for him to play in the playoffs. But that's something I really want to see is, can we make Jamal and Russ work together to at least become like a neutral kind of lineup? It can't be this disaster thing that we had with Jamal and Reggie Jackson last year. That's what I'm asking for, is can we make this neutral, figure out a way to play together? Russ is, he doesn't play off ball super well in a lot of aspects, but he's a lob threat. He offensive rebounds incredibly well, even when he's switched on to bigs. And he can screen. I don't know what volume he's going to be doing that. And, sometimes he might make a 3 or so. I'm not sure. I don't know how much he's going to be playing off the ball either. So it's also going to be on Jamal to, play more of that role. And that's kind of the whole point of having another ball handler, is that like you can be spelled of some of that responsibility, but it's going to require both of them to buy in, be a little bit more flexible in how they play, particularly off the ball.
The thing with Russ for me that's a bit questionable at times is the efficiency with the rim touches, because he can get to the paint and really create some quality 3-point shots. But in terms of conversion, I think he's dropped off significantly, especially in the postseason last year. I think he shot 6 for 35 in the series. And I want to say that can be different based on the shot quality playing with Jokic in those spots. But I think how he's used is going to matter. The other question I have is Dario Saric, because I got to be super honest. I'm a Warriors fan, so I watched him for the entire year. I loved him for the first 3 months. He was a phenomenal guy. He could shoot, score, all those things. But defensively, it became so taxing to a point where it's like he just can't see the floor, because teams relentlessly, even Denver, relentlessly put him in a lot of different actions. And my problem with him is he's not necessarily flexible enough to be a 5. Mm-hmm. So he's really just a 4. And then that begs the question where, are we saying he's going to be in lineups with Jokic? Because to me, that just sounds like a lot of work you have to do defensively to make it work, even though his shooting is a plus. How all these things merge together and play out is really what I want to see. Because I think Russ can have a ton of value if he's used off the ball, but the frequency of that is what's going to matter in terms of how effective that can be. So those are my thoughts on that. I'm curious about how you feel about that.
Yeah, when it comes to Dario, I do think that even though he really is a 4, that's the position that he plays with his national team as well. I saw them in the qualifiers. He's actually an excellent rebounder though. And I'm not sure about the guarding in space as much. I watched a lot of Warriors basketball this past year too. I live in the Bay Area and all of that. So I saw those first 3 months as well. I'm like, oh, okay, this is interesting. He's somebody that I actually wanted Denver to get. So when the Warriors got him on a minimum last season, I was like, man, come on. Yeah. But of course they picked him up this summer, for a little bit more. But I do think that the goal of getting him was to have some Jokic facsimile off the bench. You look at an Aaron Gordon, he's not a 5, but he plays backup center in the playoffs. But the way that helps, particularly offensively, is that he kind of plays point forward, point center, so that the players that we have on this team that are largely selected because they can play around Jokic can maintain that same style of play, especially offensively off the bench.
Right.
With Dario on the floor, I don't think that they're going to be doing as much switching. So I'm really curious to see what defensive scheme they opt for in those bench minutes. I think that the fact that Deron Holmes got injured in his first summer league game does actually make a really big difference, because while we had this sort of logjam at at the forward and center positions on this team. I think like more than half of the roster are 4s and 5s, actually.
Yeah.
We only really had De'Ron and Zeke as the sort of athletic versions or archetypes at that position. You've got Vlatko Čančar as well, that, you know, may be playing a bigger role in the rotation this year, you know, coming off of his ACL injury. But, you know, what I have written down here is that Dario is going to be more dependent on having certain players next to him. This is one of those like 100%. Lineup things that I alluded to, where there are certain players that will need to play with others or not with others. So I don't want an additional limitation in that Jamal can't play with Russ thing. And one of them is Dario. I want him always next to at least one of Peyton, Zeke, or even Aaron Gordon, right? Because if Dario could kind of play, you know, that defensively at that 5 spot a little bit, like Aaron Gordon kind of supplements that. He's going to be playing largely against bench units anyway, so I don't know how much it matters. I would hope that the minutes with Jokic are somewhat limited, because I think both of them do a lot better when they have more athletic 4s next to them, whether it's AG or even MPJ. Keep that length and athleticism around those guys when it comes to building that front court, and let Dario take on more of that offensive role. And, you know, for all of the let's say the downs, not so many ups of Zeke Najee's season last year, I do think that there's an opportunity for him to take on an even more limited role, particularly in the non-Jokic minutes. But maybe because we have Dario, he has some overlap with the two, but getting to play, you know, the position that he came into the league for, which is the 4 spot. And that will give him an opportunity to maybe show some more defensively. He's great at switching, but, you know, the rebounding has been an issue. And so that could definitely still be a problem, but maybe like Dario will take over more of that rebounding responsibility, and Zeke will just be there as like a secondary rim protection type guy. I'll be interested to see. Like, I do think that the coaching staff has a task ahead of them.
Definitely a task.
But you definitely see the pieces with all of these young players that can do at least one thing or another, that you just have to figure out how to make them work around these veterans, right? Whether it's the guys in the starting lineup or Dario and Russ, and trying to, you know, mix and match things. I think we're going to see a lot more mixing and matching in the lineups than we did last season. I was looking it up with the team, and one of the most, I think it was the most common 2-man pairing on the floor for the Nuggets last year was Jokic plus KCP. And now we don't have that guy anymore. So it'll be interesting to see how much more just versatility we see in the lineups that are employed, because we have a lot of guys that like might be able to play. Some of them we like need to be able to play. So we have to like figure out a way to make that work. And so I think there's going to be some experimentation going on next season.
I think a lot of that is spot on, which is why it's so hard for me to look at Denver and know how to feel. I feel like they've gotten worse, but I also feel like there's a shot where if things pan out and you get at least one of those guys to pop, it shifts the entire team kind of significantly. Like if Brown can become that guy that's close enough to where he can be confident in himself as a decision maker, that changes a lot for Denver to me. But because of that, I just don't know quite where to put him. Also, the Russ conundrum is very interesting to me, because I'm thinking about long term, where it's like, can he play with Jokic, Jamal, MPJ, Aaron Gordon? Does that work out? Like, how are teams gonna like guard them with, like, I'm just viewing all of that long term wise. But to be fair, we are a ways from that. This is the offseason, and I do think as a general upgrade, he does bring you that. I think the Dario stuff, you are spot on. Dario, from my experience, needs to be surrounded by athletes and athleticism to help cover up for his defensive flaws in spots. I feel like if he's your primary 5 with no real help side or guy that's athletic, he's going to really, really struggle. So I do think that part of it matters a lot. I also feel like for Denver, something that's going to be very interesting to monitor is honestly Jamal Murray. I think he was injured and compromised during the playoffs. I 100% feel that. Also, internationally right now, he's not really playing much better. I'm curious about your thoughts about Jamal moving forward into this season and how his role might evolve. Do you think he can get back to being the Jamal Murray that we know?
Yeah, so like I said, I started watching the team in 2023, and this is post ACL, and I've seen some of the highlights, especially from the bubble run and all of that. And I don't think that he's quite, even like at the 2023 peak, wasn't quite athletically the same as he was in the bubble. But 2023 was a really high baseline. Like that was literally an all-time kind of playoff peak that he had there for a player that in the regular season hasn't been able to make an all-star team. Jamal is the X factor. We don't win a championship if Jamal doesn't get back to the level that we need him to be. And I do think that the team has gotten a little bit worse, particularly when it comes to players that are highly skilled on both sides of the ball, but particularly offensively. So we're just going to need more from him. I think they're going to need more from him in the regular season as well. Last year, he actually was really good when he could stay on the floor. Like you could just see that the offense, despite the limitations and complaints that I had about it, it just hummed a lot better just by virtue of his presence. And even as he struggles with Team Canada, and there's really no denying that he isn't quite moving at least consistently the way that, I'd like to see, even for a player that's in the middle of the offseason, right? The thing with being on a team like Team Canada or Team USA is that you are next to other NBA players who are also going through their off season. So you're getting that direct comparison. But of course he, had the calf injury. I don't know how much he got to kind of get like reconditioned before he had to hop into Team Canada training camp and all of that. But even through those struggles, you've seen these flashes of, wow, he's like the best passer on this team, both as a primary and as a connective passer. He's just not really creating advantages as easy as he was, but he can really help make the offense flow just with some of the little things that he does. And that's the kind of stuff that he was doing in the regular season last year, when actually he looked like pretty good when he could stay on the floor. And even in his low scoring games, just his presence and his ability to do all those little things. He's the best player at getting Jokic the ball by virtue of, of that passing, and obviously their chemistry and their time spent together. They just know where each other's spots are. I do think that is important, but I think next year they're going to need a bit more from him. We talked about losing KCP just as a floor spacer, and he wasn't a high volume guy, but if Christian is going to have more of that, more of the role of being an interior finisher, as I frankly want him to be, because I think that like he should try to grow the aspects of his game where he could be, an upgrade on KCP and not necessarily always try to do exactly what KCP did, because he probably won't be as good at it. Although I also still want him to not hesitate when he has the open shots. Jamal is going to need to shoot more threes. I have complained a lot about people who are obsessed with three-point shooting in the NBA, because I don't think that the gap between, say, where like the Nuggets are and where they would need to be to keep up with, other teams overall offensively in three-point shooting is actually that big. But, they're testing the limits of how low volume of a three-point shooting team you can be in the modern NBA.
They really
in
are.
2023, they were a top offense, right? But I think they were 22nd in three-point frequency. This last season, they were dead last. And the gap was sizable, even between them and 29th place. So that's something that I think needs to improve. I think part of where that will come from is Jamal being a more willing pull-up shooter. He was excellent on his efficiency on those shots during the regular season. We've seen him struggle ever since the playoffs. I don't know if it's the calf. I don't know if it's, just he was constantly out of rhythm with being in and out of the lineup last season. Obviously, we've seen those struggles continue with Team Canada, but we need him to get back to that level. And I think the pull-up shooting is actually where the biggest gap is between us and other teams. We still generate some catch and shoots, especially with all of the interior pressure that we put. We're the best team in terms of generating points in the paint, and so by virtue of that, they're still going to get some open looks for those catch and shoot threes. But it's the pull up threes. That's right. Where, like, I watch other teams, and sometimes I'm just like, oh my gosh, if these players were on my team and they took that shot, I would want them benched immediately. But I want Jamal to take a few more of those shots, because not only can he make them, but when he is at least taking them, it puts a lot more pressure on the defense and forces them to change their coverages. We actually saw it in 2023 in the playoffs, particularly against Phoenix and against the Lakers. We're like, oh my God, what do we do with this guy? And you see teams starting to sell out to Jamal, which makes things easier on Jokic. Like, I do think that there are certain things that Jamal will need to do, not because even just because the offense needs it, but because it's going to take a little bit more of a load off on these other guys. That was an underrated part, I think, of last season, where because he was in and out of the lineup so often, it put a lot more, not just on Jokic, but on AG, on MPJ, on KCP offensively. And what that does is, it forces everybody to move up a spot in not just the rotation, but in that offensive responsibility. So when he was like back on the floor and, doing his thing, it made everyone else's jobs a lot easier because their roles were simplified. And so I think that that's something that the team is going to need from him. But I also think it's something that he's entirely capable of. We saw in the 2023 finals, with Jokic in foul trouble off the floor, this man was getting trapped at 35 feet and making direct passes on back cuts for dunks for Christian Brown, right? Like, he has such a high level that he can get to, and I'm not even saying he needs to do that in the regular season, but I think I'd like to see 75-80% of it a lot more consistently than we have in the past, because it's going to help everyone else on this team, and it's going to put them in a better position than they've been, or than they were last year, to, maybe have a high enough seed that they can start resting down the stretch and be, ready to go when the playoffs start. I think, him having a better regular season, whether it comes to like whatever the numbers, but also just being on the floor, is going to play a big part in that.
Yeah, that matters a ton. I love the point right there with that, because I think the seeding is very significant. I've been saying for years, people that say the regular season doesn't matter don't really watch the sport, because it dramatically shifts what the playoff matchups are, right? And you, as a Denver fan, 100% will know this game for sure. When you played the Spurs at the end of the regular season and that dogfight that you got into, right? Like, that shifting the matchups to where you had to draw a team like Minnesota. Imagine how different we're maybe talking about Denver if they don't have to play a team that was, diametrically opposed to them the most in a team like the Wolves. I think the matchups in the Western Conference matter, because right after that, we saw that same Wolves team who looked great get decimated by the Mavericks, who, matchup wise, Denver probably matches up with way better. So it really comes down to like the seeds and where the seeds are being drawn, which is why for me, Denver is such a hard team to rank, because in the regular season, in the Western Conference at least, there's so many teams coming back. The Memphis Grizzlies are coming. I think they are. And I think that teams in terms of regular season dominance, they're going to be really surging up. And where Denver ranks in that, I've been really racking my brain to think, like, are they a top 3 seed still? Are they more so 5 or 4? Like, I have them somewhere in that range, but I'm not confident in terms of where I want to place them yet, because the regular season, in terms of like dragging that out, that consistency and the health is going to matter significantly for all these teams.
Yeah, when it comes to the regular season, I really just find it difficult to see a scenario where they fell below 6, just because, like you said, the Memphis Grizzlies are coming back. We'll see what the Pelicans are able to do. They're always a good team when they're healthy, particularly a great like defensive team, and that's the case for both them and the Grizzlies. Then you still have, obviously, the Timberwolves and OKC, which took massive leaps last season. I think that the Nuggets, like in my mind, they're entirely capable of getting the 1 seed. But I don't necessarily want them to. Like you talked about last year's playoff matchups. I just like everybody else in sort of Nuggets Nation was really happy when they beat the Wolves in Game 80 and put themselves in a position to get the 1 seed if they wanted to. But especially in the games leading up to that, I was, still had in the back of my mind that I kind of wish they were resting at this point, because I think at that particular game, I thought the Clippers aren't going to catch them in all likelihood, as long as they don't literally lose every game down the stretch, and they can still be a top 3 seed. I'd rather them be resting. And let's say that the Nuggets had ended up in 3rd. I think that would have meant, because of the tiebreaker situation, that the Wolves would have gotten 1st place. Let's say if they beat Denver in that Game 80, and then they would have been the ones facing the Mavericks in round 2 instead of the Thunder. And we saw what kind of matchup that was for them. I don't want to worry too much about matchups, because I think Denver could have beaten the Wolves. I think if Jamal was healthier, like if all this stuff, right? Like they were up 20 in a Game 7, like you said, and they ran out of gas. So I think that being rested and healthy is way more important. That's something that Malone and the players were kind of saying down the stretch of the season, but I was clocking them as liars because they were still starting in Game 82 versus the zombie Grizzlies. Trying to secure a 2nd seed. They're a team that has demonstrated that they can absolutely win playoff games on the road. But like you said, I do think that the regular season matters, because getting higher seeding secures you a higher chance at home court advantage, particularly in those early rounds, right? No reason to potentially extend a series because you're facing a team that happens to be really good at home. If you're better than them, and you should be winning that series, because that also, like, these advantages accumulate. If you're playing fewer games leading up to, the later rounds, then you're going to have more energy. So I do think the regular season matters, and it's not just in the sense of seeding either. I think that the regular season is really important for information gathering. Everything we've talked about when it came to the Nuggets struggles in the playoffs were things that were, whether it was foreseeable, like none of it was shocking, because we'd seen it in the regular season. We saw their strengths as well. They actually were a pretty good defensive team in the playoffs, particularly in the second halves against the Lakers. But, even during, even versus the Wolves, Ant was torching them in the first half of that series. But again, I don't think the defense was the problem. But we saw the weaknesses. We saw, Jamal had a injury-riddled season, and, another thing came up in the middle of the playoffs with the calf strain. We saw limitations in the offensive consistency of Peyton Watson, and it got to the point where he couldn't be in the rotation in round 2. We saw that, the Nuggets struggled whenever they were forced to be like a higher volume 3-point shooting team, particularly with these above the break threes. And that was, another struggle that came up, and they didn't have the same, floor that they would in a regular season context, because you're playing the best teams, not just in the league, but in the Western Conference. And, often those two things are the same, because, we know the difference between the conferences. And so I think that the regular season matters because it's important for information gathering, but it does also matter, like you say, because of seeding. But I wouldn't start playing the matchup game. I would just worry about being a top 3 seed, making sure you can have home court at least through round 1. And then you never know what happens with your round 2 opponent, right? I mean, OKC went down to the Dallas Mavericks. I wouldn't necessarily go down to 5th in the case of the Mavs. And I'm not saying that they, weren't trying to get a higher seed. Obviously they were. But I think the Nuggets have an even higher sort of floor. Like Jamal was out for, I think he only played like 60 some games, like a very low number. And they still won a franchise record number of games. They tied the franchise record, right?
Yeah, still.
So if we just have health from everybody and we can figure out how to make these rotations work, they have Nikola Jokic, they have Michael Malone, who apparently like the team never goes under on the predicted win totals in his entire tenure. They've gone over. This is a team that just they won't ever tank, even for Cooper Flag, because of particularly those last two factors, just Jokic and Malone, right? Like Jokic took that team in 2022 to a 6 seed without Jamal and MPJ.
And of any star player in the league, Jokic plays the most games routinely for the most part. So
right,
that's just an insane amount of value you get.
Fewer, but just, you know, at the end of the season, like let's put ourselves in a position to be, you know, to be rested going into the playoffs. But also not worry. Like I said, don't be in a knife fight if the difference is 3rd seed and 1 seed. I think it's important to be a top 3 seed, but I wouldn't worry about games down the stretch of the season if that's already been secured. Even if the 1 seed was in, you know, in range. Like I kept joking every time because, you know, it was Minnesota and OKC were always like a game or so ahead. And every time they dropped a game, I was like, this is sabotage, because they like the Nuggets they could see the apple right there and they just couldn't, you know, look it off.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they were playing for it.
Yeah. I really can't wait, man, because I think the West is going to be in such a great place overall competitively. I think there's a lot of teams that have retooled to come back in to really, you know, attack things. Denver missed Jamal for that much time and they were still top 3. OKC was the best team in the league pretty much outside of Boston. And they just added Alex Caruso and Hardenstein, trading away Josh Giddey, who for them was kind of a liability, even though he's a good player that can fit in a different overall type of situation. Memphis is coming back. The funny part about the Wolves, because again, I keep track of every narrative, right? The funny part about the Wolves is Cat goes down at the tail end of the season and they still win a ton of games. So that's why to me, like the top 3 is such an interesting conversation, because overall, more than likely you go to the finals if you are a top 3 team. That's normally what it's been for like year after year after year after year. If you go back all these times, unless you're the 8 Miami who just completely shocked the world, it's mainly top 3 seeds that always translate. And I think Denver is 100% still capable of reaching that. I just question like the margins in terms of how many things have to go right for them, like the players popping, the health, all this stuff. And I don't know, but that's why it's going to be so fun to watch Denver basketball this year for me.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I've been so critical of the offseason. Really, it's the KCP move, because when you look at the other things that they did, I think adding Saric was a good move. I think, you know, basically replacing Reggie Jackson with Russell Westbrook was a good move. But I think losing KCP creates more problems than anything. Yeah. It makes us more reliant on Christian Payton and Julian can't be what they were last season. Julian in particular just has to stay healthy, because I thought he was pretty good on the floor when he was actually there. But I do think that I'm still pretty high on the Nuggets. Like, they have Jokic. Like I said, they're going to win a lot of games. The playoff picture creates more questions, but it's one of those things where, especially when it comes to OKC, they're an exception to this. But I have a lot of questions with even just the starting lineups of the other, like what I see as what will be the best teams in the West, to the point where I don't know how that's going to fit in a playoff environment. Whereas I pretty much know what I'm going to get from the Nuggets, at least at baseline, right? Like, they have some things they need to improve upon, but like, I know what the formula is basically going to look like. I don't know what it is for these other teams, and maybe they will figure it out. But the fact that it's a bigger question mark is one of the reasons that I'm higher on the Nuggets in the context of the Western Conference, despite being so critical of the ways that they have gotten, gotten worse. It's just like, for some of these things, like, I'm not moved when it comes to other teams. I do think the Memphis Grizzlies are, like, everyone's like, oh my God, hot take. The Grizzlies are going to be amazing next season. Like, yeah, no duh. Like, they
I don't think that's
didn't have any players all season.
Their entire roster got hurt for most of the year. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And they were a 2 seed the year before, right? So they're obviously going to be better when everybody is healthy, but I think that they're a really good team, especially defensively. It'll be interesting to see what kind of improvements we see with the offense overall, with the types of steps that Desmond Bane and Jaren were able to make when they were trying desperately to hold down the fort with Ja out.
With the wing in GG Jackson, that could also be something,
I know that they got a 50-some pick.
Crazy drafted, bro.
That was ridiculous. And I'm a bit lower on the Pelicans than a lot of people are, in large part because either Daniel Tice is their starting center, or they haven't solved the center spot to a degree. I mean, they haven't solved the starting center spot to a degree that would satisfy me. I think it's really important to have size and be a good rebounding team, both in the regular season and the playoffs. But that was already something that they struggled with, the rebounding in particular, the past 2 years. And yeah, losing Jonas, he had his defensive limitations, whatever, but you got to be able to finish possessions. And I'm not seeing that right now. And I'm really, when they made the DeJounte move, I was like, oh, I guess Ingram's moving. I'm really confused.
And he's not traded. He's still there on the team. Yeah. Exactly. Grace, I said the same thing.
Yeah.
It's just odd, right? Because no center is one thing, right? But the second thing is you're bringing in a all-star guy that was traded from a team where a lot of people said the offense is a bit questionable with Trae Young and DeJounte. They play better without each other. And he's going to another situation where, fit in on a team with Zion and Ingram, who are also better players with the ball in their hands, who all aren't great off-ball players. I think Zion is probably better just because he's a play finisher at heart, so that can work out for him. And you have no real center. And the other part is the injuries, because Zion and Ingram every year get some type of, ding. So I think your point about Denver's continuity, just in terms of knowing who they are, is a big thing that's going to separate them from a lot of these other teams who made big splash moves. I aim for the teams being top 3 based off how good you are, number one, but also how young you are, how athletic you are, how balanced on offense and defense you are, and then how many years have you played together. That's why, for me, Memphis has a good shot, because their core has been together for a long time. They're pretty good when Jamal Murray plays, and then defensively, they just have this super good identity with Marcus Smart off the bench in a good role, right? That makes sense. The Suns, I don't know what the hell to say.
Have they decided that for sure?
They have. Okay, that might be my brain getting in there with that, but I just think that, yes, I just think that him off the bench makes a ton of sense for them as a backup guard who can basically table set and give you a defensive bump off the bench. I think that does a lot. But then you go to, a team like the Suns, who they get Tyus Jones, and great pickup.
Maybe their starting point guard.
I would bring Bradley Beal off the bench, but obviously, if you bring $50 million off the bench, it looks away. But I think basketball-wise, playing all of those guards who are defensive liabilities together kind of bleeds a lot of the offensive value you might hope to get. So I don't know. It's a weird Western Conference.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And that's one of the things that's actually a concern of mine for the Nuggets, where I think maybe they got slightly better in the regular season, but slightly worse for the playoffs, assuming no leap again from those 3, kind of core young guys. But they are so young. I think compared to most other, what I would see as the highest caliber contending teams, they are an incredibly young team. But that's one of the things that I think could actually benefit them a bit in the regular season, just because you're going to have, the energy from guys like Christian and Peyton especially. I'd like to see better transition offense, just things that make the regular season easier, because why Blake half court basketball 90% of the time when you don't have to. But part of what's going to help them to actually realize that is for, again, Christian to grow in his confidence in his offensive game, for Peyton to grow a bit in his consistency in his offensive game. And for Julian, like, he just kind of needs to keep doing what he's doing because he's got plenty of confidence in his offensive game. I'm actually really excited to see him in particular next season. Like, you're the one that brought him up, but he's a lot more versatile offensively than I sort of imagined. And I wonder if that's the reason that the front office went with him. I know they described wanting to go after the best wing shooters, and there were a lot of them in this draft. Even ones that went after Julian. And I was curious what made him stand out. But when we saw him in even last year's summer league, where he didn't stand out quite as much, particularly with the efficiency, but you saw him have a range of skills offensively. And then we see it kind of all put together this year in summer league, where they put the ball in his hands for 2 games and say, go cook, go play your game. And he kind of floats the offense of a really struggling summer league team for large stretches there. So I'm curious to see what he looks like playing more next to Jokic. He didn't have as much of an opportunity to do that even when he was on the floor last year. I think we're going to see a lot more minutes with those guys next to Jokic. And part of that is because of that stat that I cited earlier, where that most common 2-man pairing was KCP plus Jokic. Someone else or multiple people are going to be taking those minutes. So we're going to get an opportunity to see how these young guys kind of develop their offensive game around Jokic as a hub, whether it's cutting, driving, shooting, operating off DHOs, etc. And I think Julian has the best opportunity to sort of make an immediate, versatile impact in that particular role. Yeah.
Well, that's Denver basketball, man. I'm excited. Great podcast. I think we covered a lot on this podcast. So I can't wait to play this back and see how these things age during the regular season. You made a lot of great points. I think the Western Conference breakdown was important because they're going to continue to get crazier. There's a lot of teams we didn't even mention that could be dark horse teams to be very good teams during the regular season as well.
Houston Rockets.
Shoot, the Spurs, and I don't even like the Spurs roster like that, but they just have a chance, so hey. But yeah, Grace, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. Please, y'all, go tap in to her show. All of the links and all that will be in the overall description. It's going to be a fun NBA season that's upcoming. This offseason is moving by pretty fast, if you ask me. I'm not gonna lie to you. I kind of feel like we're not too far from this season.
It's moving by very quickly, and it's even quicker for both Celtics and Nuggets fans because they're playing their preseason in Abu Dhabi early, so they're going to open training camp in less than 8 weeks.
Wow, yeah, that's close.
Exciting.
Yeah,
they're still playing in the Olympics for another week or so. So hope those guys get rest somewhere.
Yeah, there is a lot going on, but can't wait to see that. But yeah, people, if you made it this far, let us know what you think about the Denver Nuggets, how good they are, and how that will transition into title chances for next year. As always, appreciate you guys. Make sure to tap into this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and also YouTube at Gifted Hoops. We're working. I'm doing a lot of pods now from week to week to week. I'm actually behind. I have to cover like 2 or 3 teams in one pod if I want to make it by October, but we're getting there. I was happy to talk about Denver with you, Grace, and hopefully there's more things to come with us in season. I can't wait to see how all that goes. But yeah, peace out, people. Y'all have a good one. Peace.